The neighborhood was picturesque, the kind of place where kids played tag on freshly mowed lawns, and every house looked like it belonged on a postcard. But, beneath that charming facade, lurked a powerful homeowners association, the HOA, that ruled the community with an iron fist. Their reputation? Strict, nitpicky, and, as some whispered with a shiver, borderline tyrannical. For most residents, compliance was simply easier than resistance. But for Ethan, the newest homeowner on the block, things were about to take a very different turn. Join us on this exciting journey. Let's hit 10,000 subscribers together. Ethan wasn't one for drama, a laid-back guy in his early 30s. He'd moved into the neighborhood hoping for peace and quiet after years of city chaos. His idea of paradise? A backyard pool, a cold drink in hand, and not a care in the world. So, when he finally finished building his dream pool, complete with sleek, shimmering tiles and twinkling underwater lights, he thought he'd finally achieved it. That was until Deborah showed up. Deborah, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, didn't just knock on his door. She stormed it, like a hurricane, a heavy clipboard clutched in her hand and a smug smirk plastered across her face. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Your pool," she stated flatly, her eyes raking over it as if she were appraising property that rightfully belonged to her. "It's adequate. I assume you've reviewed the community pool sharing guidelines?" Ethan blinked, utterly bewildered. Pool sharing guidelines? He hadn't heard of any such thing. Deborah, apparently sensing her moment to assert dominance, leaned in with a conspiratorial tone, her voice dripping with saccharine sweetness. "You see, Ethan," she began, "we like to foster a sense of community here. It's only fair that everyone has access to amenities like this." She gestured grandly at the pool, as if declaring it public property with a flick of her wrist. Ethan chuckled, assuming it was some kind of bizarre joke. "Sorry, Deborah, but this is my pool. Private property." Her smile vanished, replaced by a tight, menacing line. "Oh, we'll see about that." That was the exact moment Ethan realized his peaceful new life might not be as quiet, or as peaceful, as he'd ever imagined. The first sign of real trouble arrived just days after Deborah's ominous visit. A formal notice from the HOA landed in Ethan's mailbox with a crisp thud, stamped with the official HOA logo and bearing Deborah's unmistakable signature. The letter declared that his newly constructed pool violated a recently, and suspiciously conveniently, enforced community ordinance requiring private amenities to be made accessible to all neighbors upon request. Ethan couldn't believe his eyes. It was utterly absurd. Since when could an HOA dictate how he used his own private property? He decided to ignore the letter, chalking it up to Deborah's overzealous and frankly ridiculous nature. But ignoring Deborah turned out to be a colossal mistake. Soon after, Ethan began receiving daily notices, each one more ludicrous than the last. One claimed his pool tiles reflected too much sunlight, posing a visual nuisance to passing neighbors. Another slapped him with a hefty fine for having inflatable pool floats that were deemed not aesthetically aligned with the community's meticulously curated theme. Deborah wasn't working alone, either. Walter, the HOA treasurer, became her loyal enforcer, patrolling the neighborhood with his trusty metal measuring tape and a perpetually full clipboard. He'd often inspect Ethan's property from the street, jotting down copious notes and occasionally snapping surreptitious photos with his phone. Once, Ethan even caught him peering intently over his 6-foot wooden fence, muttering something about fence height regulations. Meanwhile, the community began to take sides, a palpable tension simmering beneath the surface of manicured lawns. A few brave neighbors, their voices hushed with fear, sympathized with Ethan, quietly sharing their own tales of woe under Deborah's iron rule. "She's been doing this for years," whispered Eleanor, the elderly widow next door, her eyes darting nervously towards Deborah's house. "Once, she fined me $50 because my bird feeder didn't perfectly match my shutters. But others, too scared to cross the formidable Deborah, sided with the HOA, their whispers turning into judgmental murmurs. Rumors began to circulate that Ethan was anti-community, even selfish for not wanting to share his hard-earned private pool. Fed up with the constant harassment, Ethan decided to confront Deborah directly. He attended the next HOA meeting, hoping to clear the air and resolve the escalating issue amicably. The meeting, held in a sterile, overly decorated clubhouse that smelled faintly of stale coffee and desperation, was packed. Deborah sat at the head of a long, imposing table, flanked by Walter and Patricia, the HOA's secretary, who was diligently typing every single word Deborah uttered into the official meeting minutes. When Ethan calmly brought up the absurdity of the pool sharing rule, Deborah's expression hardened into an unyielding mask of authority. "The rules are the rules," she stated, her voice dripping with smug superiority. "And as a member of this community, you are expected to follow them. Period." Ethan counted to 10, trying to maintain his composure. He calmly pointed out that the actual HOA bylaws, the document that supposedly governed their community, didn't mention anything at all about mandatory pool sharing. Deborah's face flushed a furious red, and she quickly pivoted, launching into a barrage of accusations, from improper landscaping to unauthorized pool parties, despite the fact that Ethan hadn't even had one guest over yet. The room filled with uncomfortable murmurs as Deborah turned the meeting into a public spectacle of shaming and intimidation. The confrontation ended with no resolution, only a final, chilling warning from Deborah: comply, or face escalating fines and further, unspecified, consequences. Ethan left the meeting feeling a potent mix of frustration and simmering anger. He wasn't going to let Deborah bully him into submission. However, he also realized with a sinking feeling that this was no longer just about the pool. It was about power, pure and simple, and Deborah had absolutely no intention of backing down. The tension between Ethan and Deborah quickly escalated, transforming into a full-blown neighborhood spectacle, a real-life soap opera unfolding on their quiet suburban street. Deborah's tactics became increasingly ridiculous, almost as if she were competing in some bizarre HOA Olympics for the most absurd rule enforcement. One crisp morning, Ethan woke up to find a new HOA notice, aggressively duct-taped to his front door. This one accused him of creating a dangerous environment because the gentle, almost inaudible sound of water cascading from his pool's fountain was supposedly distracting to drivers. Seriously? As if that wasn't enough, Deborah began deploying her loyal minions to actively patrol Ethan's property. Walter, the ever-vigilant treasurer, was spotted on multiple occasions lurking suspiciously close to Ethan's fence, wielding a professional-grade decibel meter, supposedly measuring the sound levels of Ethan's completely normal backyard conversations. Patricia, the diligent secretary, took it upon herself to meticulously document anyone who dared to visit Ethan's house, logging their arrival and departure times, as if they were tracking some dangerous criminal enterprise. In reality, these unauthorized gatherings were just Ethan's friends coming over for a quiet swim and a much-needed dose of moral support. One particularly memorable afternoon, Ethan caught Walter in a truly comical, albeit infuriation, situation. Walter was attempting to measure the height of Ethan's perfectly regulation pool fence while precariously balanced on a wobbly step-ladder. He leaned too far over the edge, lost his balance with a surprised yelp, and tumbled headfirst, clipboard and all, directly into Ethan's sparkling blue pool. Ethan, despite his mounting frustration, couldn't hold back a burst of laughter as Walter sputtered and flailed about in the water, his sodden clipboard floating nearby like a sad, waterlogged shipwreck survivor. "I hope that's HOA-approved swimwear, Walter," Ethan quipped, earning a venomous glare from the soaking wet treasurer. Meanwhile, Deborah ramped up her own passive-aggressive antics. She installed a small, conspicuously placed security camera on her property, conveniently angled to have a clear, unobstructed view of Ethan's entire backyard. Ethan responded in kind, putting up a large, cheeky sign in his yard that read, "Attention, Deborah Cam in progress. Wave and smile." It quickly became a neighborhood joke, with other residents secretly stopping by to snap selfies with the sign, a small act of rebellion against Deborah's oppressive reign. But despite the occasional moments of humor, Ethan sensed something darker at play. He noticed Deborah's obsessive focus on his pool wasn't just about enforcing arbitrary rules, It felt deeply personal, almost vindictive. Digging through old, dusty HOA newsletters in his attic, Ethan stumbled upon a strange detail. Years ago, Deborah had passionately proposed a community pool initiative, complete with architectural renderings and fundraising plans, but it had been soundly rejected by the HOA board due to budget constraints. Could her intense fixation on his private pool be somehow tied to this long-forgotten disappointment? As Ethan pieced together this unsettling puzzle, he uncovered something even more concerning. During a casual conversation, a longtime neighbor offhandedly mentioned that Deborah had controlled the HOA's finances for years with surprisingly little oversight from the other board members. A seed of suspicion took root in Ethan's mind. Curious, and increasingly worried, he formally requested access to the HOA's financial records, a right he was legally entitled to review as a homeowner. Predictably, Deborah flatly refused, citing vague privacy concerns. This blatant obstruction only fueled Ethan's growing suspicion that something was seriously amiss. The emotional toll of the escalating feud began to weigh heavily on Ethan. While he tried to maintain a sense of humor and not let Deborah's ridiculousness completely consume him, the constant surveillance, the petty fines, and the underlying feeling of being unfairly targeted made him feel like a prisoner in his own home. One particularly frustrating late night, a sharp knock on his door revealed yet another official HOA notice. This time, it was a hefty fine for excessive pool illumination, claiming his tasteful string lights, designed to create a relaxing ambience, were disturbing nocturnal wildlife. It was so absurd it was almost comical, but it also felt like Deborah was deliberately testing his limits, trying to push him to his breaking point, hoping he would simply give up and succumb to her unreasonable demands. But amidst the growing chaos and frustration, a glimmer of hope emerged. Supportive neighbors, witnessing Deborah's increasingly erratic behavior and Ethan's unwavering resistance, started to quietly rally behind him. Eleanor, the kind widow next door, offered to help him meticulously investigate the HOA's convoluted financial records. A few other brave residents, emboldened by Ethan's stand, began sharing their own long-held stories of Deborah's overreach, from unjust fines for minor infractions to mysteriously missing HOA funds that seemed to vanish without a trace. It became increasingly clear that Deborah had been using her position of power for years to manipulate the community for her own personal gain, and Ethan's backyard pool had simply become the latest target in her long history of petty tyranny. Fueled by a growing sense of determination and a newfound responsibility to his beleaguered neighbors, Ethan decided it was finally time to fight back, not just for himself, but for the entire community. But he knew he had to be smart about it. Deborah was watching his every move, her eyes like a hawk, and she wasn't about to let her iron grip on the neighborhood slip without a vicious fight. Ethan realized that directly confronting Deborah head-on, while satisfying in the short term, wouldn't ultimately work. She thrived on drama and wielded her authority like a weapon. If he truly wanted to win this battle, he'd need a well-thought-out plan, one that was both clever and, in true Ethan fashion, just a little bit humorous. The first crucial step in Ethan's plan was to delve deep into the labyrinthine world of the HOA bylaws. Late one night, fueled by copious amounts of strong coffee and an unshakable determination, Ethan pored over the dense, legalistic jargon. It wasn't long before his persistence paid off. He discovered a critical loophole. While the HOA possessed the authority to impose reasonable rules and regulations, they couldn't retroactively apply new rules to private property unless specifically stated in the original community agreement. In short, Deborah's so-called pool-sharing ordinance, the very foundation of her harassment campaign, was completely unenforceable. Armed with this vital piece of knowledge, Ethan knew he finally held a significant piece of leverage. Next, Ethan decided to take the fight public, but strategically. He reached out to the handful of neighbors who had voiced their frustrations with Deborah's reign, organizing a clandestine meeting at Eleanor's cozy house. Over warm cookies and refreshing lemonade, the small but determined group brainstormed ways to challenge Deborah's seemingly unshakable authority. They settled on a two-pronged approach: first, to meticulously expose Deborah's potential corruption, and second, to rally the rest of the neighborhood to demand meaningful reform within the HOA. To build their case against Deborah, Ethan and Eleanor began their own amateur investigation into the HOA's finances. Using old newsletters, meeting minutes, and anonymous tips from disgruntled former board members, they painstakingly pieced together a deeply troubling pattern. It appeared that Deborah had been systematically funneling HOA funds into various personal expenses, including lavish landscaping for her own yard, the purchase of a brand new hot tub for her private use, and even what looked suspiciously like a family vacation disguised as a community enrichment trip. The evidence wasn't just concerning. It was potentially explosive. At the same time, Ethan started to subtly push back against Deborah's ridiculous antics in ways that cleverly highlighted her absurdity to the rest of the neighborhood. He decorated his backyard with an over-the-top display of HOA-compliant ornaments, including a comically large inflatable flamingo wearing oversized sunglasses and a tiny HOA-approved visor. Deborah, predictably, issued him another sternly worded fine for visual distractions, which only served to make her look even more petty and ridiculous to the growing number of neighbors who were quietly siding with Ethan. But the real turning point in their burgeoning rebellion came when Ethan, with Eleanor's enthusiastic support, decided to host a community pool day. He personally invited everyone in the neighborhood, explicitly excluding Deborah and her two most loyal cronies, Walter and Patricia. To Ethan's delight, dozens of neighbors showed up, bringing potluck dishes, colorful inflatable floats, and a palpable sense of excitement and anticipation. The event wasn't just a fun afternoon. It was a powerful statement. People were clearly tired of Deborah's oppressive rule, and the genuine sense of camaraderie and joy at the party proved that the neighborhood didn't need an overbearing HOA to foster a true sense of community spirit. Deborah, of course, wasn't going to let this blatant act of defiance go unpunished. She stormed over to Ethan's house during the height of the party, her face a mask of righteous fury, clipboard clutched tightly in her hand, threatening to issue fines to everyone in attendance. But before she could even utter a word of her usual tyrannical pronouncements, Ethan calmly pulled out a printed copy of the HOA bylaws and, with a triumphant grin, pointed to the specific clause that invalidated her ridiculous pool sharing demands. "Looks like you're the one violating the rules, Deborah," he said, his voice ringing with newfound confidence. The crowd erupted in cheers and laughter, and Deborah, her face now a shade of purple with incandescent fury, turned on her heel and stomped back to her house. Emboldened by the overwhelming success of the pool party, Ethan and his growing group of allies moved to the next phase of their plan, exposing Deborah's potential corruption. They drafted a formal petition demanding a comprehensive financial audit of the HOA and began going door to door, collecting signatures from their increasingly supportive neighbors. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and within days, they had gathered an overwhelming number of signatures. Deborah, sensing her carefully constructed empire crumbling around her, tried desperately to fight back. She called emergency HOA meetings, sending out frantic and accusatory emails to all residents, claiming Ethan was spreading malicious lies and trying to undermine the community. But the tide had irrevocably turned. Even some of her once loyal supporters were starting to question her leadership, especially as the rumors of her financial misdeeds gained traction and more details began to surface. The final, decisive blow came when Ethan, with Eleanor's meticulous help, submitted the compiled financial evidence to the remaining members of the HOA board and, discreetly, to the local authorities. The proof was undeniable. Deborah had been systematically using HOA funds for her own personal enrichment for years. The shocking revelation sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, and even Deborah's staunchest allies finally abandoned her, their faces etched with a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. With Deborah's power base completely shattered, Ethan and his neighbors seized the opportunity to push for real, lasting change. They proposed new leadership, increased transparency in all HOA operations, and the immediate removal of the most arbitrary and oppressive rules. The neighborhood, finally united against a common enemy, voted overwhelmingly in favor of the sweeping reforms. For the first time in months, Ethan felt a genuine sense of relief wash over him. The battle wasn't completely over yet, but the balance of power had dramatically shifted. Deborah's tyrannical grip on the community had been broken, and Ethan's clever, calculated actions had sparked a true neighborhood revolution. The big showdown arrived during a highly anticipated emergency HOA meeting. Word had spread like wildfire about Deborah's questionable leadership and blatant misuse of funds, and nearly every resident in the neighborhood showed up, packing the usually empty clubhouse to its absolute capacity. Deborah, looking pale and strained, sat at the head of the long table, flanked by her two remaining cronies, Walter and Patricia. She tried to project an air of authority, but her forced smile didn't quite reach her panicked eyes. Ethan, calm but resolute, sat among the crowd, holding a thick folder containing the week's worth of evidence he'd painstakingly compiled. The meeting began with Deborah attempting to stick to the pre-approved agenda, droning on about mundane topics like trash pickup schedules and mailbox maintenance. But as residents began to raise pointed questions about the HOA's recent actions and expenditures, it quickly became clear that this wasn't going to be an ordinary, rubber-stamp meeting. Deborah, Eleanor stood and said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the palpable tension in the room, "We have some very serious questions about the HOA's finances, specifically about some of the unusual recent expenditures." Murmurs rippled through the packed room as Deborah tried to dismiss the question with a wave of her hand. "All expenses have been properly documented, Eleanor. Let's move on." But Ethan wasn't about to let her off the hook so easily. "If that's the case, Deborah," he said, his voice clear and caring throughout the hushed room, "you won't mind if I share what I found when I reviewed the financial records?" A hush fell over the crowd as Ethan stood and walked to the front of the room, holding up copies of receipts and bank statements. He began to meticulously detail how HOA funds had been used for Deborah's personal landscaping, the installation of a luxurious hot tub in her backyard, and even a lavish family vacation to the Caribbean, all conveniently disguised as a community enrichment trip. Gasps of disbelief and outrage filled the room as Ethan laid out the damning evidence, slide by slide, projected onto a makeshift screen, showing each questionable transaction in stark detail. Deborah's face turned a deep shade of crimson, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking. "You're lying," she blurted out, her voice shaking with a mixture of fury and fear. "This is all fabricated. These documents are forgeries." Ethan remained calm, handing out copies of the documents to the residents in the front rows. "These aren't my words, Deborah," he said evenly. "These are official HOA records. Anyone can see for themselves." Walter and Patricia, sensing the dramatic shift in the room's atmosphere and the palpable anger of their neighbors, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Finally, Walter, his face pale with panic, broke the tense silence. I didn't know about any of this," he stammered, clearly trying to distance himself from Deborah's actions and save his own skin. Patricia quickly followed suit, nervously mumbling, "I just thought those expenses were approved by the board." Deborah shot them both a venomous glare, a look of pure betrayal flashing across her face as she realized her loyal supporters were abandoning her in her moment of crisis. Just as the room erupted into a cacophony of angry accusations and shocked whispers, Deborah made one last, desperate move. She stood up abruptly, pointing a trembling finger directly at Ethan. "This is harassment!" she shrieked. "I'm calling the police!" Frantically pulling out her cell phone, she dialed 911 right there in front of everyone. When the police officers finally arrived, their expressions a mixture of boredom and mild annoyance, Deborah tried to spin a dramatic tale of being threatened and harassed by Ethan and the unruly residents. But Ethan calmly presented the situation to the officers, showing them the undeniable evidence of Deborah's financial impropriety. The police, clearly unimpressed by Deborah's theatrics and recognizing the situation for what it was, a neighborhood dispute gone wild, determined there was no actual threat, and, after sternly warning Deborah about wasting their time, they left. The final nail in Deborah's coffin came when Eleanor stepped forward, holding aloft a thick stack of signed petitions calling for Deborah's immediate removal from her position. "The community has spoken," Eleanor declared, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "We demand your resignation, Deborah. Now." The room erupted into thunderous applause, with residents cheering and loudly voicing their agreement. Deborah, now visibly shaken and completely out of options, tried one last time to regain control. "You can't do this," she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "I'm the president. I have rights." But her feeble protests were completely drowned out by the overwhelming roar of the crowd. Finally realizing the utter futility of her position, Deborah, her face a mask of utter defeat, stormed out of the clubhouse, slamming the door behind her with a resounding bang. The meeting concluded with the remaining residents voting overwhelmingly to immediately remove Deborah from her position as president of the HOA and to begin the process of completely restructuring the organization from the ground up. For the first time in years, a palpable sense of unity and hope filled the air of the clubhouse. Ethan, though utterly exhausted from the emotional roller coaster, felt a profound wave of relief wash over him. The long and arduous battle was finally over, and the oppressive reign of Deborah, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, had finally, definitively, come to an end. In the days and weeks following the dramatic HOA meeting, the neighborhood felt like a completely different place, as if a dark cloud had finally lifted, allowing the sun to shine through. Deborah's ignominious resignation sent immediate ripples of positive change throughout the community. The remaining HOA board members, Walter and Patricia, quickly stepped down as well, finally acknowledging their own complicity in Deborah's years of mismanagement and questionable ethics. A temporary leadership committee was swiftly formed, with Ethan and Eleanor among its key members, tasked with the monumental job of rebuilding the HOA from the ground up, ensuring transparency and fairness would be the guiding principles moving forward. The very first order of business for the new committee was to conduct a comprehensive and independent forensic audit of the HOA's long-neglected finances. The audit, conducted by a reputable local firm, confirmed everything Ethan had painstakingly uncovered and, to the shock of many residents, even revealed a few additional instances of Deborah's blatant self-dealing. It turned out that Deborah's years of unchecked power had left the HOA in a precarious financial state, with significant funds wasted on personal luxuries and an astonishing amount squandered on frivolous and often vindictive fines. These shocking revelations only strengthened the community's collective resolve to ensure that such a blatant abuse of power would never, ever happen again. Ethan, who had initially just wanted to enjoy his backyard pool in peace and had never intended to get involved in the often turbulent world of neighborhood politics, unexpectedly found himself at the forefront of the movement for positive change. With Eleanor's invaluable help and the enthusiastic support of his neighbors, he meticulously drafted a new set of HOA bylaws, emphasizing complete financial transparency, fundamental fairness in all rule enforcement, and clearly defined limits on the HOA's power and authority over individual homeowners' private property rights. Absurd and oppressive rules, like the infamous pool sharing ordinance, were swiftly struck down, and new, robust checks and balances were carefully introduced to prevent any single individual from ever again wielding unchecked authority within the community. The neighbors, who had previously kept to themselves, often avoiding each other out of fear of attracting unwanted HOA scrutiny, began to genuinely connect and rally together in a way they never had before. People who had once exchanged only strained pleasantries now engaged in open and friendly conversations, sharing ideas for community improvement and even organizing casual get-togethers and potlucks. Ethan's backyard, once the epicenter of conflict and Deborah's obsessive attention, quickly transformed into a vibrant hub for community events, hosting everything from lively summer barbecues to cozy movie nights projected onto a screen by the shimmering pool. The inflatable flamingo, once a humorous jab at Deborah's nitpicking, became an unofficial, beloved mascot for the neighborhood's newfound unity and spirit of cooperation. Deborah, meanwhile, quietly faded into complete obscurity. Rumor had it that she had moved to another town, though some residents joked, with a touch of lingering bitterness, that she was probably already trying to establish a new, even more draconian HOA somewhere else. Her sudden departure was met with a collective sigh of relief and perhaps just a touch of schadenfreude, but no one in the neighborhood missed her presence for even a single moment. For Ethan, the resolution of the conflict wasn't just about the sweet taste of victory. it was also about the unexpected and transformative journey he had undertaken. He often reflected on how a simple desire to enjoy his backyard pool in peace had unexpectedly turned into a challenging but ultimately rewarding battle for fairness, integrity, and the very soul of his community. What had started as a frustrating, almost comical, conflict had ultimately transformed him from a quiet newcomer into a respected leader and, unexpectedly, a cherished friend to many of his neighbors. One warm evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns, Ethan lounged by his sparkling pool with Eleanor and a few other close neighbors. They laughed easily, sharing stories and reminiscing about the often absurd ordeal they had all endured, marveling at how much their little corner of suburbia had changed in such a short time. Eleanor raised her glass of iced tea and grinned warmly at Ethan. To Ethan, she said with genuine affection, the man who fought the HOA. And actually won. Ethan chuckled, raising his own glass in return. To the neighborhood, he replied, his gaze sweeping over the smiling faces gathered around him. We're definitely better together. As the group clinked glasses in a gesture of shared triumph and newfound camaraderie, the soft, inviting glow of the pool lights reflected in the tranquil water, a serene and beautiful reminder of everything they had collectively overcome. Ethan leaned back in his comfortable lounge chair, finally feeling a deep sense of peace and contentment. He knew that his once troubled neighborhood had finally transformed into the kind of close-knit, supportive community he had always hoped for. The pool, once a symbol of bitter conflict and petty tyranny, had now become the heart of a united and thriving neighborhood, and Deborah's oppressive reign was nothing more than a distant, slightly ridiculous memory. Valuable lesson. The story of Ethan and his fight against the overbearing HOA serves as a powerful reminder that even seemingly small acts of resistance against injustice can spark significant change. It highlights the importance of knowing your rights, the strength found in community, and the fact that sometimes, a little bit of humor can be a surprisingly effective weapon against even the most formidable of bullies. Don't be afraid to stand up for what's right, even when the odds seem stacked against you. You might just inspire a revolution. What are your thoughts on this story? Have you ever dealt with a difficult HOA or a similarly challenging situation? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more exciting tales, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends and family, and hit that subscribe button along with the notification bell so you never miss out on our latest and most entertaining content. We are here to keep you entertained and inspired.